Good afternoon. Yes, I'm Simon Bennett, and I've been involved in Crossrail since the beginning as one of the teams seconded from Transport for London into the Cross London Rail Links company. Prior to my current role as Crossrail Head of Learning Legacy, I have successively been a Transport Planner, then Consultation Manager, Petitions Manager, and then Head of Stakeholder Engagement. The promotion and delivery of the Crossrail programme has involved extensive communication with directly impacted stakeholders and all of those interested in the scheme. Starting with initial engagement during route option selection, through pre-authorisation consultation and the hybrid bill process, to the extensive provision for community relations and wider communication during construction. I will explain how Crossrail managed this work, ensured people were kept informed about how the project would affect them, and built and maintained the reputation of the delivery organisation. As all of that spans 16 years of work, I will only be able to go into so much depth, but I hope that with current and upcoming content on the Crossrail Learning Legacy website, there is plenty more for you to look into afterwards if you would like. So, first I will introduce the project to give you the context. Then I'll explain the various types of stakeholders that Crossrail has identified as needing particular communications approaches. I'll then explain how we engaged people through the three main phases of the project. That's the development, authorization, and delivery phases. And then I'll wrap up with some lessons and recommendations for others who are promoting and delivering similar schemes. So, introduction. Crossrail is the largest single enhancement to London's transport network since the Underground was first built, connecting 41 stations running from Reading in the west to Shenfield and Abbey Wood in the east, through 42 kilometres of newly constructed tunnels underneath central and southeast London. When it opens as the Elizabeth line, it will for the first time connect Europe's busiest airport, Heathrow, with the key employment hubs, the West End, the City of London and Canary Wharf, on a single rail line. Within the central section, 24 trains per hour will operate in each direction, enabling 200 million journeys per year, which is a 10% increase in central London's rail capacity. Funding for the project is £14.8 billion, and we are within that budget. Construction is 87% complete, and testing in the central section will begin this year, with services beginning on the central section in December next year. As you have probably heard, Crossrail has had a long history. The scheme on the current alignment dates from the Central London Rail Study of 1989. However, plans for mainline trains on an east-west alignment under London have been raised many times over the years since the Metropolitan line started things off in 1863. The first Crossrail bill was promoted by London Underground and British Rail between 1991 and 1994, but the Select Committee rejected it. In 2000, the Strategic Rail Authority recommended that the project be revived, and Cross London Rail Links, a joint venture between the Strategic Rail Authority and Transport for London, was created to develop the scheme and make a submission for powers. CLRL went through the process of developing a case and consulting on a scheme twice. This was due to the need to gain approval from the Treasury to proceed, which was obtained through their running an independent review led by Adrian, now Sir Adrian Montague, who had previously worked with many government bodies. Approval was obtained to submit a bill in February 2005, after which came the simple matter of 3 years in Parliament before royal assent in 2008 and the construction phase, which began in 2009. At the outset, CLRL had a central route which had been set by the safeguarding for the original 1990s scheme. Safeguarding is a process where the Secretary of State makes a direction which requires local authorities to refer local searches and planning applications which would conflict with the proposed development, to refer those to an appointed organisation. London Underground had been managing the safeguarding for both Crossrail and the Chelsea-Hackney line, which is now Crossrail 2, since those directions were made in 1990. And this responsibility was then transferred to Cross London Rail Links. The first step in developing the scheme was to identify appropriate routes to the east and west of London to maximise the transport and business case for the scheme. And this process led from this long list of options to a single scheme, which is of course the Elizabeth line. You will have a long time to become familiar with this map and our new line colour. Crossrail's authorisation process was quite successful, but it is useful to bear in mind a few advantages that our scheme has had in contrast to some others. Firstly, we had a safeguarded route. The project was known and previous organisations had already raised it with landowners, though some of those landowners had of course moved on and replaced by people who perhaps hadn't paid that much attention to their local authority searches. Secondly, most of the new construction for Crossrail is under central London, which is a place where a fair proportion of people accept development as a fact of life, and most of the rest of the route is on existing railways. Opposition tends actually to be strongest where there are going to be completely new impacts. Thirdly, the scheme was obviously going to benefit people in the areas that would be affected by construction. And we also have had cross-party support throughout our life. We believe this is because the benefits of the scheme are very clear. These are more interesting ideas. In 2000 to 2001, when the Strategic Rail Authority were working on the London East-West study with Transport for London, the London Mayor and Assembly had only just been created and were therefore keen to make their mark. In terms of alignment between London and central government, Ken Livingstone, despite being an independent in his first term, was aligned with the Westminster government. And this continued when Boris Johnson was mayor at the key stage in 2010, when the project was being considered in a spending review by the coalition government and could have been cancelled or cut back. And lastly, the economic background. Previous projects, and indeed the previous incarnation of Crossrail, were started when the economy was booming, but by the time they got to authorisation, things had changed. If the 2008 crash had happened in 2005, things could have been very different for us. Our stakeholders. We identified our stakeholders through standard stakeholder mapping processes and have reviewed them periodically throughout the phases of the project. Different audiences have had varying levels of influence at different stages, so this is merely a list. Starting with future passengers. The users of the service are a key group. However, the 2018 users will mostly not be those individuals who were consulted in 2003. We therefore have to consider the consultees in 2003 as a representative of the users. Businesses will be key beneficiaries of the improved capacity and connectivity and can be easy to contact through representative organisations such as the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry, London First and the Federation of Small Businesses, which are all well funded and have effective contacts with government. Even a public sector organisation has to understand its relationship with its sponsors and funders, and in the early stages CLRL was as much promoting the project to government as it was the community. This takes place at two levels, with the civil service and with Westminster politicians. And there is a similar set of officer and member audiences at London and local authority level. Local authority officers being particularly important in the case of a large scheme, because an Act, Development Consent Order or Transport and Works Order can disapply controls which local authorities have over development. And I'll explain more about this later. A major construction project will of course have temporary and probably some permanent impacts on communities, with land take, visual amenity, noise and vibration, and construction traffic being some of the biggest concerns. It is very important to contact these communities at an early stage. There are other bodies which have statutory powers which were impacted, such as English Heritage, the Environment Agency, and utility companies, and some of these require particular clauses in the Crossrail Act to deal with their areas of responsibility. Likewise, there are the rail companies, owners and operators, and the Office of Rail and Road. And beyond all of those, we have the national and indeed global audience of people who are interested in the project. Keeping the profile of the project up with those audiences, which has been done throughout the construction phase, has paid dividends. The development phase. The first thing that Cross London Rail Links did was to identify a long list of route options for services outside the central area. The tunnelled route having already been developed for the 1990 scheme and safeguarded from conflicting development. This was then reduced to a short list, which was discussed with local authorities and government bodies, and was then the subject of a stakeholder consultation in 2002. This consultation sought views on these options and on the appraisal framework criteria that would be used to choose between them. The stakeholder consultation led to the selection of a preferred route on which CLRL was given the go-ahead by government to launch a public consultation. Ahead of the consultation period, we arranged a public awareness programme with advertising and leaflet distribution at stations to raise awareness that the consultation would be happening in autumn 2003. This was particularly useful, as building awareness is difficult and takes time, and launching without it might have meant that people were only finding out about the project towards the end of the consultation period. We established a help desk with a local call rate phone number and staff in-house to respond to calls and emails during the working day. We used an external company to answer phone calls outside that time, but not a call centre, rather a communications firm who had provided the same service for the Channel Tunnel Rail Link project. Their operative answered calls from home and were extensively briefed to fully understand. We also set up a stakeholder database so that we could manage all inquiries, track progress in responding, and have records of what had been said. Very importantly, before the consultation began, we contacted all the owners of land that would be directly affected. In this, the referencing contractor staff were the first point of contact from the project to affected parties, and we made sure that they had clear information about the proposals, and we had the ability through the help desk to offer those people an interview with the Transport for London surveyors who would be involved in the acquisition process. We followed the guidance on consultation as it existed at the time, and this has evolved significantly since then, and there is of course now a professional organisation, the Consultation Institute, which offers specific training and also audit and review of organisations' consultations. This was not available to us. On this slide, I've included the objectives we set for the consultation and some visuals of the mobile unit we used and of an information centre exhibition being held in the Town Hall in Ilford. To ensure we reached all audiences and had information which was clear and addressed the concerns we expected, we had a suite of information about the project. As this was 2002-03, much of it was printed, but a future project could do much more to deliver this online. As at that time, the concern was not to exclude those without internet access, whereas now the aim of government is to be digital by default. Of this list, I will particularly pick out information papers. These were short explanations of the way the project expected to manage areas of key concern, for example, ground settlement, explaining clearly what might happen and what the project would do to mitigate impacts and protect people and property. Over time, as these information papers were subjected to review by sponsors and legal experts, they perhaps became less easy to read, and so in due course during the construction phase, some of the really important ones were supplemented with summary leaflets. I'll also pick out our Young Crossrail programme, which was designed to excite young people who would be future passengers and possibly future engineers. And this grew during the construction phase to be a key part of our skills strategy. We made sure to staff our information centres events with the engineers and planners who were developing the scheme, briefing them beforehand to ensure they had the necessary skills and giving them advice on how to deal with consultee questions. Consideration of the first business case led to a second round of consultation, and having a second round was helpful as it gave an opportunity for us to feed back on the changes which had been made since the first, and because the first had built familiarity, resulted in more responses with more detailed comment. As well as the public consultation, we set up a number of forums through which we could work issues with the organisations with statutory powers. The high-level forum was the top of this tree, and was chaired alternately by the Crossrail Minister and the Mayor of London. A subgroup was formed to appoint and manage the work of the Independent Complaints Commissioner, whose office was established so that anyone who felt that their complaint had not been satisfactorily addressed by Crossrail had an opportunity for appeal. The Planning Forum and Environment and Heritage Forum were convened to work through the processes which we put in place through the Crossrail Act for detailed consents. These were set out in the Planning and Environmental Memoranda respectively, and in the Construction Code, which governs the behaviour of those delivering under the Act in areas such as working hours, site security and community relations. And this addresses the point I made earlier about the powers which local authorities and other statutory undertakers have and how they're managed under the Act. Together, the Code and the Memoranda are known as the Crossrail Environmental Minimum Requirements, along with the Register of Undertakings and Assurances. And these are called the Environmental Minimum Requirements, or EMRs. And so now into the authorisation process. In 2005, in February 2005, the Crossrail Bill was deposited. It sought powers to authorise the works, which were described in the long title of the bill, and for the Secretary of State to have the power to appoint nominated undertakers to undertake those works, subject to their complying with the EMRs. The Act gives the Secretary of State the power to acquire land and to appoint an agent for that purpose. And it also gives outline consent to the works described, with schedules which set out the processes to obtain detailed consents from the relevant authorities. The picture here is the DfT's parliamentary agents handing over some of the bill documents to the committee clerks. The whole process involved a huge amount of paper. Many copies of all of the deposit documents listed here. I wouldn't expect future projects to need to print anything like the number of copies we did, as the information will be so much easier to place, index and access online. Alongside the bill documents themselves, several allied documents were produced by the DfT or CLRL. And the last line here, the notices, is one of the most important. For some property owners, a recorded delivery letter with parliamentary notice on the envelope was the first communication from the project which they actually responded to. This was despite having received the invitations to the consultation and having targeted letters beforehand. Projects really must do everything they possibly can to avoid that being the first that people react to the project. The bill process took over 3 years in all, but only a small part of that was actual committee hearings. 365 petitions were received to the initial bill, but as things proceeded, 4 additional provisions were submitted, to which a further 99 petitions were received. Aspects of the project which received a significant volume of petitions were, in Hanbury Street, Spitalfields, the construction of a shaft for ventilation emergency escape and for the launch of tunnel boring machines in an area of dense housing and narrow streets. In Mayfair, the routing of the tunnel south of Oxford Street. In Romford, construction of a depot and the need for a dive under to access that depot, which would require land take from a playing field. And in Shenfield, the lack of benefit from the proposed services at a station where longer distance services call and therefore offer faster journeys to Liverpool Street than would be available on Crossrail. We were able to make changes in some of these cases, which addressed the concerns to at least some extent. The TBM launch at Hanbury Street was obviated by a revised tunnelling strategy, and the shaft was eventually deleted, and the depot was moved from Romford to Old Oak Common. There were petition points from the Corporation of London in relation to the entrance at Liverpool Street Station, and Greenwich Council calling for a station at Woolwich, which, among other issues, the Commons Committee required us to address. The summer recess in 2006 was used to negotiate with Greenwich and Berkeley Homes to enable a station box at Woolwich to be added to the project without increasing the scheme costs. The Lords process was much shorter, with only 113 petitions on subjects where negotiation was already underway. And as you can see, things really took off in July, with the last parts of the process taking place literally in a matter of days. During the parliamentary process, we focused our communications efforts on petitioners, as you would expect. The consultation team was moved to report to a head of government liaison and became the petition management team. The remaining communications resources in CLRL concentrated on working with business and political stakeholders to secure the funding for the project. The petition management team involved responding to petitions with responses which had to be agreed by the DfT. We then negotiated with petitioners on issues which could not be addressed through a simple response, and then worked with the DfT-appointed legal team, parliamentary agents and barristers to brief them to make the project's case in the Select Committee. The result in many cases was either giving an assurance or a specific undertaking in the form of a legal agreement on the way the project would be delivered. These were all collected in the Register of Undertakings and Assurances, which is binding on all nominated undertakers to comply with. Undertakings and assurances are often combined under the term commitments. So we're now into the delivery or construction phase. Once the Act was secured, the project delivery organisation had to ensure the commitments made would be delivered. The Register of Undertakings and Assurances was disaggregated and communicated, the software system being built to record and track responsibility. Requirements were included in the works information for our contracts, so the contractors were aware of their obligations under the EMR. The petition negotiation team transitioned to become the client community relations team required by the construction code, working with contractors' community relations representatives to communicate with local residents and businesses and to address complaints. Members of the team were co-located with the delivery teams on sites so that they could work closely with the project managers. The consents team became the client-level organisation, overseeing the seeking of detailed planning, environmental and traffic. The stakeholder communication functions were then reunited with the changes to Crossrail, which saw it reconstituted as a delivery organisation and renamed Crossrail Limited. The External Affairs Directorate includes 4 functional areas: community relations, media, public affairs, and marketing communications. Internal communications was deliberately not part of this organisation and was instead in the Talent and Resources Directorate. However, the branding, which was developed by Marketing Communications, was used across both internal and external communication, with the graphic design resource in Marketing Communications being available to internal comms and to the Health and Safety Directorate to produce many materials, including the on-site newspaper, the Values Awards materials, and posters and booklets on safety issues. In the early stages of delivery, TfL and DfT as Crossrail sponsors kept close links with CRL, and a communication strategy was developed in collaboration with them, and a quarterly high-level comms meeting held to check progress and ensure alignment. Over time, the sponsors gained confidence in CRL's managing of communications, and the coordination is these days mainly by ad hoc direct contact between the relevant members of the team. Crossrail's own strategy was refreshed in 2014 as the External Affairs Strategy and is clear and simple. The aim is to establish and maintain an outstanding reputation for the organisation, and it's delivered through these 3 key activities. Our whole stakeholder base is provided for by activity in one or more of the 3 areas listed. We can, of course, only check our progress to the reputational aim through data, and we have regular market research done through an extension of the contract TfL has with Ipsos Mori. This research has demonstrated that we have consistently had a very high reputation in comparison with other similar organisations, such as train operators, TfL, utility companies, and the like. The largest team within External Affairs is Community Relations, responsible for ensuring the commitments in the construction code on communication with communities are met. The aim of community relations activity is to establish and maintain an outstanding reputation with local authorities, neighbouring residents and businesses, and other local stakeholders to enable the successful delivery of Crossrail. We do this through the following principles. Chief among them is no surprises, on the basis that if people have information about what is going to happen in their area, they are much less likely to complain. This is, of course, always as long as in all our endeavours with communities we do the right thing. We aim to put ourselves in the position of a member of the community who is being inconvenienced and do whatever is practical to address their concerns. By doing the right thing and by being open and honest, we build trust and create advocates within the local authorities and the community. There have been some specific programs of communication over particular impacts and mitigations. A comms plan was developed for each and appropriate materials produced. Communication with those whose property needed to be acquired was managed by the Land and Property team through the expert surveyors from Transport for London. Those whose property was located above tunnels received a leaflet about ground settlement and the ways that we would control it. Some of our commitments in the Register of Undertakings and Assurances required us to provide method statements to beneficiaries before we began work. And finally, as part of our mitigation of construction noise, residents could be eligible for either secondary glazing to insulate their windows, or in some cases, temporary rehousing for a short period. The visual here is the cover of the explanatory leaflet we produced on that subject. Our contractors are required to employ community relations representatives. These CRRs are the first line of communication with those who are local to our work sites. They send out information, respond to complaints that come to the Crossrail Help Desk, deliver community investment projects such as this activity day at the Royal Docks Learning and Activity Centre, and arrange site tours so that local communities can see the work we are doing. This picture is of a tour as part of Open House Weekend, which we participate in every year. One way we have used the web to communicate is our Near You part of our website. The whole route is mapped and individual items of work marked with an orange hard hat icon, which links to the information sheet explaining that particular item. Information sheets are required to be produced and circulated by the community relations representatives 2 weeks before each particular item of work starts. And we do all we can to make these accessible, though it is always a struggle to simplify the language and keep the number of words down, which is why we have the right-hand summary column on the information sheet here, which has the really fundamental information. Our site holdings are an excellent resource for communication and also to demonstrate that we care about visual impact. In some cases, we have consulted with the communities over what the appearance should be, and we have refreshed our holdings several times over the life of the project to update messages and ensure that the holdings do not become tired. This does have quite a cost, and it is also difficult to plan for when contractors want to change holding lines. At key locations with large levels of work, we have established community liaison panels, which are independently chaired, usually by a local councillor or council officer. These were initially held quarterly, and they give us the opportunity to give a longer and more detailed update on the upcoming works. We aim to ensure that representative groups such as residents associations are all invited, but we do keep the liaison panels invitation only to manage numbers. The media team within External Affairs is responsible for press and new media relationships. Creating news releases is a key part of this, but also working with, for example, the producers of the £15 billion railway documentary series, who came to us with their proposal. We, in the end, recruited a member of the team specifically to work with them. Our website is regularly refreshed with new content, and we are very active on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We share progress photos and videos, our regular moving forward video, and the content that we place on the Learning Legacy website. The other areas within External Affairs are marketing, communications, and public affairs. Marketing communications manages the relationship with the communications functions of our contractors, reviewing any communications they wish to put out and coordinating site visits and filming. These requests can become significant and can't be allowed to jeopardise progress on the works, but are particularly important in getting Crossrail's messages out to the appropriate audience. We produce an annual sustainability report each year, and for a more general audience, we have created 3 paperback books on the tunnelling, design and archaeology of the project. The books accompanied exhibitions in partnership with museums, 2 with the London Transport Museum and 1 with the Museum of London Docklands, and 2 of them are still on if you would like to visit them. The Public Affairs team manages the relationship with politicians at all levels. We need to ensure that route MPs are kept up to date so they know where to go if there are constituent inquiries. We organise visits for government ministers and arrange Crossrail appearances at committees in both Westminster and the London Assembly. In all of these, we are communicating the wider benefits of the scheme, such as the jobs we are creating and the skills that we are building in the UK workforce, and also sharing our learnings through the Learning Legacy and through the many, many requests for visits we get from other major projects internationally. The results of the market research are used to check our progress. These are random surveys within the postcodes where our sites are located in the case of the Businesses and Residents survey. So I think it's understandable that local authority respondents have a higher familiarity than business and residents. However, overall, these are good results, which we always aim to improve. We track our favourability rating, which we think is generally very good for an organisation, which is, of course, creating disruption. Again, in this, local authorities are the standout. And both of these support our contention that the best way to improve favourability is to build familiarity. Favourability is best among those who know about the scheme and has consistently risen as the project has progressed. Clearly, communication is extremely important in building the reputation of an organisation. And so, in conclusion, here are some of the lessons that we have learned. Crossrail has a good benefit-cost ratio under traditional cost-benefit analysis, but work done for the Mayor's Office on the wider economic benefits really demonstrated that there are benefits beyond that. The wider benefits to the UK supply chain and our apprenticeship programme created goodwill in the construction phase. The support from well-connected business organisations really made the difference in keeping the pressure on government to approve the project in the early stages. Fielding our project experts at information centres build trust with the community. We learned that plain English in our communications is sometimes really difficult to deliver when the wording is constrained by legal requirements. Also, the records of and clarity during the consultation is key to demonstrate that when and what was said to petitioners. These days, very easy to use modular customer relationship management systems are available, which were not 15 years ago. Some of them can even be accessed via the web, unlike the one that we have. And market research is essential to test effectiveness. During consultation, this obtained positive public views which don't always get heard during consultations. and it showed that our communications had reached the areas affected. Now, to go beyond what we did, we believe that future projects should have earlier and deeper involvement with developers and local authorities to get the maximum benefit of the scheme and maximum value capture. To get the mitigation policies that we put in our information papers agreed as early as possible. To use the web more, as we do now. To consider the rise of buy-to-let, because communicating with the person who has the real long-term interest in a residential property is not always so easy these days. You should always, in consultations, review what has been missed. Consultees don't always say what their concerns really are. We had locations where we had discussions and no petitions were received, but when the compulsory purchase notice was given, people were not as unconcerned as we had thought. And finally, the £15 billion railway series has really driven up the understanding of the project and excited people. We could possibly have started on one of those earlier if we'd been in the driving seat. So thank you very much. I hope this has been interesting and useful, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. Firstly, what role did BIM play in stakeholder management?
Basically none. Our BIM process is internal to the production, to the design of the project. But no, that's not true actually. Let me talk about our Crossrail maps. What's the word? Application which we have on the intranet here. We used the mapping data to map all of the properties affected by the scheme, and we used it particularly in terms of answering safeguarding queries. So we knew where a property was, we knew exactly where the tunnel was in relation to a property, we could check whether a property was going to be affected by tunnelling, and we could respond to people on that basis. So the Crossrail maps, which is an aspect of our use of BIM, I think is probably the way in which that was done.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think that sort of covers off a few of the questions that have come in around how do you prioritise stakeholder communications and stakeholder management? Was there a set way that you prioritised, or chose different routes towards engaging with different stakeholders?
As I said, it varies over the life of the project. So as I said, during the authorization process, we were absolutely focused on the people that were petitioners. And as a result, I would say we probably lost focus on the general audiences for the project. In fact, one thing that we did during that process, because we were having to agree everything that was going up on the Crossrail website with the DfT, is that we actually almost switched off the Crossrail website and put it just onto a single holding page. That's not something which would fly in 2017 or in the future. And then obviously when we went into construction, we had to rebuild some of those relationships and communication that we had with the general public, as it were. At every stage, obviously, you're slightly cutting a cloth to who you think is going to impact the progress of the project, and the petitioners during the parliamentary process are absolutely most important. Throughout it all, though, probably the top most important organisations to be talking to are the local authorities. So we always had a very good and extensive relationship with our local authority officers, particularly in central London. The majority of the construction was. As to say, I mean, throughout it, we have had a team which has been divided into areas, into functional areas, who have responsibility for different types of audiences. So the consultation team was responsible and became the community relations team, responsible for the people who are directly impacted, the residents and community. We've always had a public affairs organisation which is facing the politicians. And they've each of those teams has had its own strategy, which links into an overall external affairs strategy.
Fantastic, thank you. And one of the questions that have come in is, how big was your communications team?
Varied, obviously, over the phases. During the consultation, there were 17 members of the consultation team. At one point, community relations got, I think, as high as the low 20s. The overall external affairs function, I think, is about, at its peak, was about 40 people.
Oh, wow. Okay. And at the offset, how was the overall budget estimated at the start of the project?
Well, we didn't. Again, the project was was delivered in those phases. So the budget for what we were doing in community relations for the construction phase wasn't really considered at the early stages. When we set up the Cross London Rail Links company, we were given a fixed amount of money from government, and so we identified what was needed to run a consultation, and it was about, it cost, I think, in terms of staff and materials cost, about £1 million to run our consultation. That was out of an overall budget of 158 million for developing the scheme to get to a bill. Once we were in the bill process, we were then doing further negotiations with the DfT over the funding of the scheme, but actually the comms functions reduced ever so slightly during that process. But once we were into construction, that was we had a we started from first principles and what we wanted to do, and then we've revised it every year from there on within the overall funding envelope of the project. It wasn't a case of setting our budget all the way through to the end of the project on day one.
Perfect. And one of the sort of key questions that are coming through is, where you had kickback from the consultation, or where you had people that maybe didn't support Crossrail, how did you handle that? And was there any key things you learned from that, which may be able to use in Crossrail too?
Well, obviously there will be people who you can't satisfy. What the key lesson, I think this is pretty obvious to anyone, is you just must be polite and reasonable in all of your communications. Where someone is not willing to be reasonable, you have the option of stopping the conversation and perhaps passing them to the Complaints Commissioner as an issue, which during the consultation process was actually a slightly different role called the Crossrail referee. Really, it's just a matter of doing everything you possibly can to address a concern that you think is legitimate. You know, you don't assume that you know best. If there's a way of changing the scheme, and this is what happened to Hanbury Street, we absolutely were able to make a really significant revision to the project to remove that tunnel boring location. Yeah, you've got to basically be polite and clear, but you also must also be honest. And where you're not able to change a scheme, you need to make that very clear to people.
And one of the questions comes here: why was the internal communications excluded from the stakeholder management work stream?
We had a talent and resources directorate, which was much more than your typical HR department. It was called, it had a section within it called organisational development that was responsible for establishing a values and culture across the project. And that's actually one of the things that I think has been really, really good on Crossrail. We've built a single team from the people who are direct Crossrail employees and our, not just contractors, but we have 2 delivery partner organisations. And we've created a single team out of that, and we've done that through our culture and values work. That was managed through talent and resources, and talent and resources felt that internal communications and communicating with all of the various people that are working on the project, with the internal to Crossrail, within our partners and within the contractors community, was something which was part of that more than it was part of external affairs.
Perfect, thank you. And looking at the different generations you have to communicate to, were there many young people in your community panels? And also within your communications, how did you tailor your messaging to each different generations and needs from there?
That's probably one of the things we didn't do as much as we could have. I think that obviously there was no social media at the time that we were setting up the project. And as far as community liaison panels goes, we're generally wanting that to be part of, to be consisting of residents associations and representative organisations. We can't open that to absolutely everybody in a community because it wouldn't be a manageable meeting. And residents associations, by their nature, tend to be run by older people who perhaps have they own properties rather than rent them. would do more, I think, this in a future project with social media to try and reach those audiences, because they are not ones that we would traditionally get to a community liaison panel, for example.
Ah, perfect, thank you. And how do you ensure consistency of communication between Crossrail communications and the contractor communications? Was everything directed through Crossrail, or was communications have a guidance document to be followed?
There's requirements in the contracts which require contractors to submit all their press releases, etc., to us. Any articles that or appearances at events, etc., to be connected to be reported to us so that we can review them. And we have a regular contractor communications group where the contractor comms managers and our marketing communications team meet and look at what's coming up over the next 3 months and basically establish that coordination.
Perfect, thank you. And how do you measure the outcome of what type of metrics were in place for stakeholder engagement? What does
what I suppose we really should consider is a learning legacy paper which goes into detail about our market research. The charts that I've shown are kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of the questions that we ask people about their familiarity with the project and how they feel that we've done. But the market research is the way in which we manage it. Just as you would expect, we go into a great deal more depth when we ask a question than are you familiar with the project.
Perfect, thank you. And I guess quite a nice question that comes through is, what really was your biggest challenge?
This is the thing. I was part of the community relations function for most of the construction phase, so I can't really answer for the balance between community relations, public affairs, media, etc. I felt that we have had a very, very positive ride throughout the construction of the project. There have only been a few cases where we've had to do things which we needed to work. And I've got one example of this, actually, which is that we had to change the way in which we were going to work at Paddington Station. We gave a commitment that if it was safe, we would maintain Eastbourne Terrace, which is a road which goes down the side of Paddington Station, open during construction. However, when we let the contract and the contractor came in, they said it was not possible to build that safely. So we had, after we had made commitments to people, we had to negotiate with them to say, with Westminster Council in particular, to say it's not safe, we can't do what we said we could do. So we had to carry out a communications exercise to actually close Eastbourne Terrace, and we had to work with the community who would be inconvenienced by the changes to bus routes and the closing of that road. That was a heck of a challenge, but I think it was delivered well, and actually we reopened Eastbourne Terrace on time, and it's been reopened for several years now.